Hello, everyone. Today we'll start talking about Sandel's great book on justice, what's the right thing to do. So here's an obvious claim that we've encountered in the past. A good person, a just person, a virtuous agent wants to promote the common good, wants to bring about a good society, a just society. The virtuous agent is not just concerned with his or her own well-being, with his or her own happiness, but looks at the good of the whole, is a good participant in society, is someone who tries to actively bring about a just world. So that's an important claim. That's a basic, obvious claim. But from that claim, a crucial philosophical question arises. What exactly is this just world? What does a just, good society look like? What is the thing that the virtuous agent is trying to do when he or she is no longer not merely concerned with his or her own happiness and well-being, but is looking outward, is trying to build a good society? What does that good society look like? What is the thing that the virtuous agent aims at? That's the basic question for this book. What is a just society? And as we'll see shortly, there are multiple different conceptions of that. There are incompatible different conceptions of what a just society looks like. So we'll be looking at some of the main conceptions of a just society and some of the main reasons for thinking that those conceptions are correct, and some of the main objections to those conceptions of the good society, the just society, with the hope that we'll develop a more informed appreciation of what a goodness is, what justice demands. So let us begin. So one of the great things of this book is that it begins with examples, and examples have a neat way of bringing out crucial ethical, philosophical considerations. So here's a cool example, a real example. So in the summer of 2004, Hurricane Charlie devastated much of Florida and other places, and a lot of things happened because of the devastation. But here's some particular thing that happened. Some sellers were charging 5 to 10 times as much more than typical for basic necessities. So for example, this picture here, someone is charging $10 per roll of toilet paper, which typically goes for like $1. And this is happening in the amidst a crisis, right? People are losing their homes. People are, struggling to have access to food and shelter and things like that. And in the midst of this huge need from consumers comes about, and some sellers take advantage of the situation by charging a lot of money. This practice of charging a lot of money, 5 to 10 times as much, for example, for basic necessities has a name. It's called price gouging. So here's the question for us: is price gouging immoral? And my sense is that most people have one of two responses. And here's the first response. Of course it's immoral. It is wrong, and here's why it is wrong. It is wrong for sellers to take advantage of calamities to capitalize on human misery and suffering. So the practices are wrong. The sellers are doing something wrong. And the reason for thinking that they're doing something wrong is this misery and the calamity, right? What the sellers are doing is just they're bringing about bad consequences. They're making things worse in many ways. So a common response to price gouging practices is to say that they are wrong, and that they're wrong precisely because they, because of the bad consequences, the misery and the suffering that they involved. There's a second response that is also pretty widespread, and it says also that it is wrong, but for a slightly different reason. And it says something like this: it is wrong for sellers to be so greedy and lack basic decency. And notice that it's the same basic judgment. The practices are wrong, they're immoral. But the second response points to a very different reason. It's not really the consequences, the misery, the suffering that is happening. It's something about the character of the sellers. There's something vicious about it. There's something inhuman about it. There's something immoral about them. Their character, the kind of persons that they are, is reflected in those practices. The question of who would do that comes to mind, right? What kind of a person would be willing to do that? And all of the answers to that question are not very positive, not very affirming, right? They're negative. So my sense is that most people have these two responses. They're very natural responses to hearing about practices of price gouging, especially when the buyers are poor, right? They can barely afford to buy food to begin with. If they're super wealthy and they have to spend a little more money on basic necessities, perhaps the judgments are not as well grounded. Um, but there's also a third response. In that third response, it looks very different. Here's the third response to price gouging practices. There is no such thing as a fair price other than what is settled by supply and demand. If the buyer is willing to pay the asking price, nothing wrong has happened. This third reply is championed by people that call themselves libertarians, and we'll take a deep look at their rationale later on and look at some objections and so on. But for now, these are people that think of morality as somehow following from the market. The moral categories that count in assessing people's behavior are those and only those that are intertwined with economic considerations. Supply and demand settle the price, the market price. And this way of thinking says there are no external moral categories that should be employed. There's a deep sense in which economics takes precedence over other ways of thinking. And in fact, economic considerations ground or just are moral considerations. The moral person is the one that follows the market. There's this kind of recognition of the market, or this scene of the market as the ground for morality. And we'll look at more reasons for that later. For now, these are three very different responses to the practice of price gouging. Behind these responses, though, lie three crucial ideas that help develop theories and conceptions of what justice amounts to. So here are the three main ideas behind thinking of a justice, or at least some of the main theories have appealed to these three ideas to try to ground conceptions of the just society, the good society. So idea number one is that a good or just society is one that maximizes the welfare or the happiness of everyone involved. Ask yourself, what does a good society look like? What does a just society look like? And idea one says, the just society is one in which all of the participants are as happy as they can be. Their welfare, which includes economic welfare, is maximized. That's a mark, one of the main marks of a good and just society. Here's a second idea that is just a different kind of idea. That does not appeal to welfare at all. A good or just society is one in which individual freedoms are respected. If you look at the good society, the just society, here's what will stand out as a distinctive characteristic. The freedom of the individuals within it are protected and respected. There's no violations of people's freedoms or liberties. Now, idea two does not ensure or guarantee idea one, and likewise, idea one does not ensure or guarantee idea two. In other words, there could be a society in which people's welfare is maximized, but individual freedoms are not respected. And likewise, there can be a society in which individual freedoms are respected, but the people are miserable. So those ideas just push in different directions. They characterize societies in a different way. But there's a third idea, an important idea, that is also different, independent from these two. And it says that a good and just society is one in which virtue is promoted. In other words, if you look at a good society, you would identify policies, institutions, structures that are conducive to being good. Societies in which it is easy to be virtuous and good, or at least it is easier than otherwise. Societies that are built precisely so that people can be good people, can flourish as individuals. And notice that that's independent from one and two. These ideas are independent. And they do not undermine each other, but they do not support each other either. And we're going to look at a few theories in this book, and they all appeal to one or more of these ideas in different ways. They all make a hierarchy of the important, the relative value of these ideas. So let's look at libertarianism a little more carefully. So libertarianism and price gouging. Libertarianism rests on two claims, and we'll spend some time later trying to define more carefully libertarianism. But for now, it's people that care about free market, people that put the free market front and center as the conception of a good society. So here are the two claims supporting libertarianism in the way in which they respond to price gouging. So claim number one, the free market promotes the welfare of society as a whole by providing incentives for people to work hard and supply the goods that others want. Notice that claim one appeals directly to idea one that we had before. A good society is one in which welfare is maximized. And now libertarians say, yeah, that's a good mark of a good society. Welfare is maximized. And furthermore, the free market is the way of going about maximizing welfare, especially economic welfare. Society has more stuff by allowing the free market, no government intervention. That's claim number one that is put forth by libertarians. The second and most important claim, the one that goes at the heart of libertarianism, though, is this one, claim number two. Free markets respect the freedom of sellers and buyers to do what they will please with their property and their money. And at the heart of libertarianism is claim two, the thought that a good society is one in which individual freedoms are respected. And if you have a seller who's asking for a price for a particular good, and if you have a buyer that is willing to pay for that, is voluntarily, is willing to pay for that product by the price, asking price, the good society allows for that, respects that. In fact, in some ways, that enshrines that kind of interaction. And free markets do that. And libertarians think that is what it is to be a good society. That's what it is to be a just society. So going back to price gouging, whether or not price gouging is acceptable depends on the extent to which these claims are respected. In other words, we should ask ourselves, when people engage in practices of price gouging, do those practices maximize welfare? Claim number one. Or do those practices violate or permit freedom of sellers and buyers? And depending on how exactly we answer those questions, the libertarian is going to answer the price gouging question, the price gouging policy consideration. Put differently, whether or not price gouging is immoral depends on whether or not allowing those practices, engaging in those practices, respects individual freedom, and in the long run promotes or maximizes happiness and welfare. There's a very different way to respond to price gouging practices, and this is put forth by Aristotle. We'll look at Aristotle more carefully later. But here's some of the basic Aristotelian claims, which look very different from the things we've said before about the libertarians. So, basic claim about Aristotle: a good society promotes virtue and discourages vice by every participant of society, elected officials and civilians. Everyone, all of the institutions, all of the policies and structures of the society are geared towards, are designed for the sake of making good people, virtuous people, developing individuals' human capacities flourishing. And that's what a good society, that's the main mark of a good society. Furthermore, in times of crisis, good societies, those kinds of societies that promote virtue, come together and neighbors help each other. If you live in a good community and your house burns down, here's what happens if it's a good community, says Aristotle. The neighbors come in, they help you, they take out of the fire if they need to, they give you food and shelter, and while you get your stuff together, they come to your aid, they care for you. And that's what good societies do. The price gouging situation looks very different. A society in which people exploit their neighbors during the worst calamities for the sake of maximizing profit is not a good society. It is not the neighbors coming to the aid of the neighbor. It is the neighbors coming to see what they can exploit during the moment of crisis. So from the Aristotelian perspective, a good society is one in which virtue is promoted. Price gouging is obviously immoral and a mark of a bad society, or at least to the extent that is permitted. Why? Well, because excessive greed is a vice, and a good society should discourage it. There's this characteristic of the sellers that is being portrayed in their practice, that is manifested in their practices. They are excessively greedy, and that's not good. Good society should not allow that. So it is crucial to note that Aristotelian points and observations do not make any reference to things like welfare, maximization of economic welfare, or respect of individual freedom. There's no such, those considerations are just not part of the picture. It is making the conditions that give rise to good citizens being virtuous. Those are the marks of a good society. And price gouging is judged immoral because it's clearly involves excessive greed and things like that. So those are very different ways of responding to price gouging. But you see the ways in which philosophical, ethical considerations come to bear in the forming of a judgment. And the question before us is, how should we think? Which of these very different ways of thinking about a good society is the better way of thinking about it? Which is the just way of thinking about it? Those are the hard questions for us. And how do we go about answering those questions? Well, Sandel points to what he calls moral reflection. Moral reflection is the thing that we thinkers, theorists, people that study justice, the thing that we must do for trying to answer those questions. It's not just a matter of putting forth, oh, here's what libertarians think, here's what Aristotle thinks, and so on, but trying to engage with them, to assess them, to think critically about who's correct and why we should think it is correct. So here's an important point. To ask whether a society is just is to ask how it distributes things that we prize, things like income and wealth, duties and rights, powers and opportunities, offices and honors. A just society distributes these things in the right way. And of course, the basic question for us now is, what's the right way of distributing these goods? What does a good society look like? So what's the right way of distributing these goods? To answer these questions, we must engage in moral reflection and thinking about and assessing the different kinds of answers and the reasons for those answers. And at the heart of that is this basic idea. Moral reflection is the interplay between general moral principles we find plausible or credible or reasonable. Things like, quote, respect free decisions between consenting adults, end quote. Arguably, that's a principle. Like, yeah, we should respect free decisions between consenting adults. To intervene in that, at least in principle, in general, seems problematic, seems immoral. It is immoral people that intervene in other people's free consenting decisions. So moral reflection is the interplay between those general principles and particular moral judgments. Judgments like the one I was assuming most of you had when I described the price of the case of price gouging. A judgment like, quote, charging $10 per roll of paper, toilet paper, during a time of crisis is wrong, end quote. If you look at a particular case and you think about it, you'll be able to identify some morally relevant considerations and come to a conclusion. That practice, that action is wrong. That practice, that action is right, and so on. And now moral reflection is the taking a step back and trying to harmonize, trying to assess the interplay between those general principles in those particular judgments. At the very least, a coherent, intelligent agent that is thinking about these things has harmonized, cohesive, intelligible system of beliefs in which those principles and those judgments come together, that they cohere, they're harmonized. Sometimes we might look at a principle, respect free decisions between consenting adults, and think, yeah, that's a great principle. But then we look at a particular case like price gouging. And many times price gouging practices can be described as instances of that very principle. There are cases in which a seller wants to, $10 per roll of toilet paper, and a buyer says, yeah, here's $10, I need toilet paper now. So they may count as instances of the general moral principle, but yet most of us want to say, even though we want the principle, we grant that the principle is a good one, that particular case, the case in Florida, was wrong. That particular instance, that judgment is that practice was wrong. So that, at least at that level, seems inconsistent. We must find ways of reconciling. We must find ways of identifying whether there are limitations to the principle, whether the particular judgment is mistaken, or whether the judgment is appealing to other ethical considerations. In that process of going through that, of teasing that out, that is more reflection. And that is the kind of thing that we're going to be doing for the next several classes. Engaging in more reflection for the sake of having a more developed ability to understand what a good society should look like. So clear examples, clean examples, like price gouging examples, help us identify morally relevant considerations, things that aid us in the process of moral reflection. Things like welfare matters, respect individual freedom matters, people have an intrinsic dignity, virtue is good, promoting virtue is good, and so on. So looking at particular examples helps us identify those ethical considerations and then trying to put them together into coherent theories so we can better understand what it is for society to be good, what is for us to be good. And the text does a good job of laying a lot of these examples. For there are several trolley examples, there's the Purple Heart example, there's the bailout example. So please spend some time looking at those, trying to understand the underlying ethical considerations behind those examples. That's a good way of training your reason to engage in more reflection. Okay, well, let's end there. I'll see you next time.